Which simulation software tool, and there's many, many of them, dozens, should we buy and use? And I have been asked this question multiple times over a many-year period. And I always answer that question with a lot of questions. I remember the wonderful scene in The Day the Earth Stood Still when the extraterrestrial first meets Albert Einstein in his study, and Albert Einstein tells him, "Oh, please do sit down. I have several thousand questions I would like to ask you." The extraterrestrial says, "First I want to tell you my mission, why we traveled here to Earth." And Einstein responded, "Good, that was my first question." So whenever I'm asked this question, I have many other questions to ask in return. And the PowerPoints to come will illustrate how that conversation should most productively go. So here's my objective. If I'm going to be introducing new people, a new company, to become new users of simulation, this is what I want and this is what I don't want. And sadly, I have seen the red things more than once. I've certainly seen the green one many times, but I've learned over many years how to guide people away from the red things. Now, at really good situations, and I've seen many of those, a simulation model might be used over a period of well over 10 years on an ongoing basis to keep constant improvement. Improvement, as you all know, is to be continuous. It is not something we do on Thursday and then we're all done by next Monday. So a simulation model should be a living document, and to make it have a good chance to be a living document, it's really up to the modeling experts to make sure the model is thoroughly and correctly documented and commented. Now, very first question might be, after pointing these things out, what is it you'll be simulating? And here's a partial list. The items in it are general enough that all of them cover a lot of territory. Historically, and even before I got into simulation in the late 70s, historically, beginning about in the 60s, simulation was something you did for a factory. And it has greatly expanded all up and down the supply chain, distribution and warehousing, right up to retail. Simulation has become very important in healthcare services. Transportation helps with the supply chain. In healthcare, for example, how about the movement of pedestrians and vehicles within a hospital? Some of the vehicles might be wheelchairs or orderlies pushing gurneys with patients lying down on them. Some of the pedestrians might be nurses hurrying to the next assignment, and other pedestrians might be patients in physical therapy who of necessity walk very slowly. These ideas have been extended to the layout of cruise ships, where many of the passengers are elderly and do not walk fast, or questions within transportation networks and movement of pedestrians, boarding and unboarding trains in a subway station, and issues like, what if the warehouse or the factory or the hospital had to be evacuated externally because of fire, or shall we say internally because a tornado is approaching? These are very different issues. And for any of these processes, do you visualize it as push or pull? A push project, and that's a term originating in manufacturing, the machine finishes its work and wants to get rid of the part, send it downstream as quickly as possible. A pull system says, don't send the product in making farther down the line until there's a call for it to ignore bottlenecks. Well, the point of this question is, some simulation software is easier to use and more natural with a push system. Other simulation software is just the opposite. So that's a good question for the consultant to ask. And under more specific context, there's 4 bullet points here. The first 2 pertain in particular to things like factories and warehouses, the traditional users of simulation. The third bullet point can be almost anywhere. Workers with multiple tasks in a factory, orderlies with many different things to do in a hospital, security guards with many different responsibilities in a shopping center, hotel workers with many different responsibilities inside the hotel. For example, one famous hotel owner who's been very successful has ordered his workers, if you're doing a routine task and a guest asks you how to get to a particular conference room in the hotel, do not point. Stop what you're doing and walk the guest there. Then go back to what you were doing. Behavior like that is very commendable, and some simulation softwares make it easy to model in order to assess the total time demands on the worker. Other simulation softwares are particularly good with this 4th bullet point. And these are 2 different points here that have to be modeled differently. Airline passengers in the business cabin, well, they paid for it. They get to board the plane first. But that's very different from, you have the green light, but you have to wait because an ambulance or a fire truck with its siren wailing is driving cautiously through the red light to get to an emergency situation or take a seriously ill person to a hospital. That second situation is called preemption. And it's a very different thing to model than simply priority. The take cuts is what simulation software calls priority. These are 2 different things, and a given software package may do well or clumsily at either or both of them. Now, here is a strategic question really to be addressed by top management, especially before the first time any particular company decides to avail itself of the many benefits of simulation studies. You can pay someone to do the work for you. You can do the work internally with your own experts. You can do the first project by having a consultant do it, but arrange that you're going to have your own people watch the consultant very closely and get informal training as you go along, so that, as I often put it, the consultants do project 1 while you watch. You do project 2 while the consultant watches and checks for any difficulties or problems. And pretty quickly, you've migrated to becoming self-sufficient in simulation. However, that's a likely strategic decision only if your company is going to have enough simulation projects to keep these highly skilled people busy a good part of their time doing simulation, because that's an investment in training and acquisition of a skill. So that leads into the second bullet point. And if you do plan this, are the people familiar with or eager to become familiar with either of these types of programming concepts? Because some simulation packages work a lot better and are a lot easier to use from an object-oriented point of view. And others are easier to use, go more naturally, with a procedural programming point of view. And both of these issues explore a trade-off. Very generally, the more powerful the simulation package is, the harder it is to learn, and the steeper its learning curve is. Now, some of the new packages are doing very well in the sense the early learning curve is gentle. And by the time you've climbed the low hill, the gentle hill, you can model most situations. But then to model really complex logical situations, you have to climb up the steep part of the mountain. And that's another possibility for bullet point 1. You may reach a situation where you're capable of doing the easier projects or parts of projects in-house and using a consultant for the harder parts. That's what many of our clients do. So that's another possibility. And under animation, well, do you need it or want it? Three-dimensional animation is beautiful. It can help communicate the model results. It's lovely and impressive to look at, to show the boss. And it also has a hidden danger. It is very possible for an inadequately trained person to build a beautiful animation that is sitting on top of a logically wrong model that gives wrong answers. And by the way, that is worse than having no model at all. Much worse. So that's a danger to be avoided. And you may want to import files for backdrops of the animation. You may want your own icons. The simulation software has standard icons that look like a machine or a forklift truck or a doctor or an emergency room bed or whatever the icon might be that's needed. And usually those are just fine, but you could design your own icons with some packages. And you may want to capture animation movies for playback. That's a frequent desire to communicate model results. And some questions on statistics. Now, first of all, the fundamental truth. You cannot get all these wonderful benefits of simulation unless you have statistical expertise nearby. Now, nearby can mean various things depending on your strategic decision. Nearby can mean that your own model builder is or becomes a statistical expert. It may mean that the model builder has a co-worker in-house who's a statistical expert. It may mean that you're working with a consultant which will certainly have statistical expertise readily available. So you have to have statistical expertise somewhere. Well, now to the first item on this slide. You probably will need a distribution fitter. You can get it bundled with the software, or you can buy one separately, or you can tell the consultant to use theirs and provide the results to you. Well, first of all, it might be nice what is a distribution fitter? Say you want to model a hospital, and you need to model the process of a nurse giving a patient an injection. Well, that takes a certain amount of time, but it's not always the same amount of time. So you gather some data on exactly how long it takes the nurse to give various injections. And then you have a bunch of numbers, maybe 20 to 50 to 100 numbers, and you put those numbers in the distribution fitter, and the distribution fitter tells you whether it recommends an exponential, a normal, or some other statistical distribution to use in the model as an accurate representation of the data. So there has to be a distribution fitter floating around somewhere. And later, you're going to need to do statistical analyses. Some simulation packages do it inside the package. Or you may have, or need, or have the consultant use their copy of one of these packages. Those are two examples, and there's many others. They're not statistical. They are not simulation, rather. They are statistical. And a given company may already have one for other purposes, and that's great. And then you ask, well, how well will the simulation software communicate with the statistical analysis package? And how sophisticated? This third bullet point is a way of asking how powerful the statistical package needs to be. If you compare alternatives two at a time, you can use a student t-test. If you want to compare many different alternatives, you need a package capable of designing and running a design of experiments. And interface. Well, most people say yes to the first bullet point. That's getting more and more common. And ramping up, in my observation, is it's not as far along yet, but people are starting to say yes to the second bullet point. So as you likely know, Excel and Access are both part of Microsoft Office, a workbook or a database, or maybe some other database. And what are any of these things in use that you want the simulation software to go with? Statistical quality control, enterprise resource planning, SAP, the big German one, and so on. So if you need interface ability, that's the thing to check in the software. And then, are you going to buy a package at all? Will the boss open the purse? If not, you can still have projects done on the copy of the simulation software the consultant has, but you have less flexibility for the long run. That may be all right if you're going to use simulation only occasionally. Now, how many, you might ask yourselves, how many simulation software package names have I recommended? And I would hope you'll all agree that very deliberately that number is 0. So what might you do next? Well, there's several things you might do next. And this is one of the best ones. A nice, long, leisurely shop talk, unhurried. And I recommend the shop talk be more with a technical person than the salesperson, that's based on these questions. And by now, I hope you are thinking of a lot of other questions. Now, it's no accident my contact information, and we'll repeat it, was on the title slide. And there's other things you could do if you feel completely new to simulation. A very good way to ramp up your comfort level at very little risk or cost is to go to the right conference. And there's two conferences in particular that I can recommend. And one of them is the Winter Simulation Conference, held every year in December. This coming December, it's in Savannah, Georgia. The other is the annual Institute of Industrial Engineers Conference. That comes every May. It was in Montreal a month or so ago, about 6 weeks ago, and I think it's going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, coming up next year. So getting acquainted with simulation at a conference is a very good idea if you feel you're really a newbie, N-E-W-B-I-E, the informal word, new to simulation. And another productive thing you might do is join some LinkedIn groups on simulation. There's some good ones. Some are for a particular software package, and some are for simulation in general, and it's the latter type that I'd recommend you get started on.